so I did email this to you. It's Harrison Bergeron. This one's with all my notes on it. You can have it up on a device, print it out, or you can just sit and listen because I'm going to be reading the entire story to you. Alright, it's option number 3. Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. The year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal in every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. Some things about living still weren't quite right, though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the HG men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son, Harrison, away. It was tragic, all right, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except for in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He's required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking unfair advantage of their brains. George and Hazel were watching television. There were tears on Hazel's cheeks, but she had forgotten for a moment what they were about. On the television screen were ballerinas. A buzzer sounded in George's head. His thoughts fled into panic, like bandits from a burglar alarm. "That was a real pretty dance, that dance they just did," said Hazel. "Huh?" said George. "That dance. It was nice," said Hazel. "Yep," said George. He tried to think about the ballerinas. They weren't really very good, no better than anybody else would have been anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked so that no one, seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face, would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with a vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did 2 out of the 8 ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had asked George what the latest sound had been. "Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer," said George. "I think it'd be real interesting, hearing all the different sounds," said Hazel, a little envious. "All the things they think up." Said George. "Only if I was Handicapper General, you know what I would do?" said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the Handicapper General, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers. "If I was Diana Moon Glampers," said Hazel, "I'd have chimes on Sundays. Just chimes, kind of in honor of religion." "I could think if it was just chimes," said George. "Well, maybe make 'em real loud," said Hazel. "I think I'd make a good Handicapper General." "Good as anybody else," said George. "Who knows better than I do what normal is?" said Hazel. "Right," said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son, who was now in jail, about Harrison, but a 21-gun salute in his head stopped that. "Boy," said Hazel, "that was a doozy, wasn't it?" It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor, were holding their temples. "All of a sudden you look so tired," said Hazel. "Why don't you stretch out on the sofa, so as you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch?" She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. "Go on and rest that bag for a little while," she said. "I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while." George weighed the bag in his hands. "I don't mind it," he said. "I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me." "You've been so tired lately, kind of worn out," said Hazel. "If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and just take a few of them lead balls out, just a few." 2 years in prison and a $2,000 fine for every ball I took out," said George. "I don't call that a bargain." "If you could just take out a few when you come home from work," said Hazel. "I mean, you don't compete with anybody around here. You just sit around." "If I tried to get away with it," said George, "then other people'd get away with it, and pretty soon we'd be right back to the Dark Ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you?" "I'd hate it," said Hazel. "There you are," said George. "The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society?" If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to this question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. "Reckon it'd all fall apart," said Hazel. "What would?" said George blankly. "Society," said Hazel uncertainly. "Wasn't that what you just said?" "Who knows?" said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first as to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had a serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, and in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, "Ladies and gentlemen." He finally gave up, handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read. "That's all right," said Hazel about the announcer. "He tried. That's the big thing. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard." "Ladies and gentlemen," said the ballerina, reading the bulletin. She must have been extraordinarily beautiful, because the mask she wore was hideous. It was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men. And she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was a warm, luminous, timeless melody. "Excuse me," she said, and she began again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive. "Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a grackle squawk, has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete, and is under handicap, and should be regarded as extremely dangerous." A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron flashed on the screen upside down, then sideways, upside down again, then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween and hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the HG men could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half-blind, but to give him winging headaches besides. Scrap metal was hung all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people, but Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. And to offset his good looks, the HG men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his clean white teeth with black caps that snaggletooth random. "If you see this boy," said the ballerina, "do not, I repeat, do not try to reason with him." There was a shriek of a door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen jumped again and again, as though dancing to a tune of an earthquake. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, as well he might have, for many was the time his own home had danced to the same crashing tune. "My God," said George, "that must be Harrison." The realization was blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George could open his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hand. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. "I am the Emperor!" cried Harrison. "Do you hear? I am the Emperor. Everybody must do what I say at once." He stamped his foot, and the studio shook. "Even as I stand here," he bellowed, "crippled, hobbled, sickened, I'm a greater ruler than any man who ever lived. Now watch me become what I can become." Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper. Tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bar, the padlock that secured his head harness. The bar snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber ball nose, revealed a man who would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. "I shall now select my empress," he said, looking down on the cowering people. "Let the first woman who dares rise to her feet, claim her mate and her throne." A moment passed, and then a ballerina rose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the mental handicap from her ear, snapped off the physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last of all, he removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. "Now," said Harrison, taking her hand, "shall we show the people the meaning of the word dance? Music!" he commanded. The musicians scrambled back into their chairs, and Harrison stripped them of their handicaps too. "Play your best," he told them, "and I'll make you barons and dukes and earls." The music began. It was normal at first, cheap, silly, false. But Harrison snatched 2 of the musicians from their chairs, waved them like batons as they sang the music as he wanted it played. He slammed them back into their chairs. The music began again and was much improved. Harrison and his empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely, as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weights to their toes. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the laws of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gamboled, and spun. They leaped like deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet away, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutralizing gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in the air below the ceiling, and they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the Emperor and the Empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them that they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergeron's television tube burned out. Hazel turned to comment on the blackout to George, but George had gone to the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with the beer, paused while his handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. "You've been crying," he said to Hazel. "Yep," she said. "What about?" he said. "I forget," she said. "Something real sad on television." "What was it?" he said. "It's all kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. "That's my girl," said George. He winced. There was the sound of a riveting gun in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," said Hazel. "You can say that again," said George. "Gee," said Hazel, "I could tell that one was a doozy." Alright, now let's try to make some sense of this. I did not do cubing for this. As you can tell, all of my notes are kind of just on the story, so I'm just going to go through the story. Alright, so first thing I want to mention is that this was published in 1961. Because of that, it was commenting on a lot of things that were happening at the time, although they are still quite relevant today. The first is that the draft was instituted in 1948, which of course is referenced by Harrison being taken from his home at 14 because the government said so. Government says so. A lot of young boys were taken from their homes to go fight in World War II and Vietnam. And I'm pretty sure a few other wars, but I don't know history all that well, so look that up if you want to talk about this and make those references. Absolutely happened in several of the wars that we've had. And it also, because of the time frame, is satirizing the Cold War and Cold War propaganda. It is very anti-communist and therefore anti-extreme socialist. Now, socialism is an idea before it's implemented, and it becomes things like communist Russia, like communist China, like fascist Italy, Nazi Germany. These are all places that were seen as socialist initially, but then the rules became so skewed by the dictator that it created a lack of equality rather than creating equality. And that is why a lot of this focuses on equality, because it's part of that dystopic text that we were talking about. It's an extreme dystopic text trying to be seen as a utopia. We see this start off with, in the future, the year was 2081 and everybody was fine. But how were they equal? The three things that they mention is that they were equal in intelligence, they were equal in looks, and they were equal in strength or quickness. Why focus on these three things? Well, because those three things are rather externally measured things. They aren't who make us who we are. Looks change, we can gain intelligence, we can gain strength and speed, given various things. Now, we can only become so much of each one of those based on our genetic makeup because, unfortunately, we are not all created equally. I cannot beat a 300-pound man. It's just not gonna happen. A midget shouldn't play in the NBA. Remember, we were talking about egalitarianism. Yeah, ruthless egalitarianism. There's just no way that some of us can do these things. So we're not physically created equally. However, the point of egalitarianism in general is that we're all treated equally. And that's where this is playing in that notion of equality, which is why he references the 211th, the 212th, and the 213th Amendments. Now, we don't have that many. That would be ridiculous. Could you imagine what type of society and what type of discontent people must have had, what type of protests and all these other things to get to 213 amendments? Now, the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th. Let's talk about those real quick. The 11th gives the state power over its court systems, which means that it can essentially rule its state as it will, unless it comes against one of the federal laws, in which then you can go up to the Supreme Court to battle. But overall, the states are given kind of close to free reign of having power over its own laws and citizens, etc. Then the 12th is what created the Electoral College. And as we know, the Electoral College is people that we vote for to represent us to vote for the president, essentially. And it's done in various different ways, and you can do the electoral college math in different ways to get different answers. But we also do things like gerrymandering, and popular vote actually doesn't matter in a lot of this stuff, even though we're doing these things, because again, we're a republic, we're not a democracy. We vote for people locally to represent us. And they go vote in our behalf. Our actual vote locally for like president doesn't matter. We don't choose the president. We choose the people who choose the president for us. And they don't have to listen to us. By law, they do not have to listen to us. So that's representative of things that are happening here. It seems like people were given power enough that they changed things and gave themselves more power, until the point that the people really had no opinion, or they were too stupid to form their own opinion because of the laws that were placed on them to limit them or suppress their intellect, which we'll get to talking about here in a moment. All right, and the 13th Amendment was the one that abolished slavery, even though we still have slavery in prisons. Felons are treated as slaves. It actually excludes that in the amendment, but essentially the 13th Amendment is what abolished slavery. Although it seems pretty clear here that they're not far off from that type of mentality in the socialistic society. You know, all people working for the dictator, all the slaves working for their owner. Who owns you? The people who are in charge. I could get on a really big rant about this, and I'm going to try not to, because this is a hot button for me. But you also might think about the idea of wage slaves. We are, most of us, wage slaves. We live paycheck to paycheck, and that's another way to control us and make us unable to rebel, because we don't have the time any longer to worry about those things that are happening around the world, because we're too busy trying to take care of our own, because it's so hard to take care of our own. Okay, ranting. So I want you to notice that essentially he's creating his own definition of what equality is within the setting, so that we understand that early on. It's mentioning really early Hazel and George's ability to think. This is part of the whole story. It really influences what we think and what we see in the story. And so he says, it's tragic. George and Hazel couldn't think very hard about it. Now, Hazel has perfectly average intelligence. What does this mean exactly? It's playing on the idea that Americans have declined in intelligence because of technology or social media or any of those things that people like to rant about, like I like to rant about how our intellect has decreased. And part of this is because of she can only think in short bursts. We've talked about this before. This is exactly the type of connection they're trying to make with technology and phones and TV used to keep us from being able to pay attention to things around us unless the commercials came on, and so we started splitting our focus and those types of things. But there's a recent study that showed that our current generation cannot focus for more than 4 to 8 seconds at a time. That is less than a goldfish. We're pretty on par with a goldfish. And so if we can't focus and we can't think or pay attention for longer than a couple seconds at a time, because remember, ding, 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 distractions, things that continuously distract us, then how are we able to form coherent thoughts? That is part of the problem that they're trying to think of, and their inability to actually stand up for themselves, to change the society around them, to even question the society around them. We see several times George thinks about something that might need change, or starts to analyze something, and then something goes off in his brain so that he can't actually finish that thought and think about the things that is wrong with his world, because therefore he can't change them. It's part of the repression of the intellect, which is why he's got that thing in his ear. So even people who are intelligent continuously to be distracted so that they don't actually do anything to change the world. The idea that George is taking unfair advantage of his brains. Is it unfair to use something that you have? It's yours. Is it unfair to be smarter than somebody else? Is it unfair to be stronger or prettier than somebody else? Things that we are essentially born with. Is it unfair to be treated differently or be treated poorly because of the way we were born? Is it unfair for us to be able to use our brains? This is something that's connected to recent issues. Now, obviously, there are racist and sexist and ageist and all those. It's discriminatory connections to it, but there's also the idea of just simply intelligence being thought of here. There was a big hoopla about parents in an uproar that some kids had unfair advantages because their parents read to them at home. Because other parents, of course, may have 2 jobs or 3 jobs, busy lives, and don't have the time to read at home to their children or spend time studying and doing homework, that the people who did had an unfair advantage. The problem with thinking of this way is that, yes, sometimes circumstances suck, but we all make the choices throughout our life to put ourselves in circumstances. And when you're a parent at that point, you have put yourself there either by having sex and having a kid when you might not have been able to take care of it, or not choosing to educate yourself or find a job that's going to make you able to take care of yourself, or moving out of a place that limits you from doing those things or any of the choices that we do have. Now, sometimes there are circumstances outside of our control, I understand that, but a lot of the times we're in the place that we are because of our choices, and so it's not unfair. It's just that people made different choices and have different lives and have different opportunities. We all should be given the same chance to have that opportunity, but whether we get it or not is not really up to the system. It's up to us to find it. And so no, it really shouldn't be seen as unfair that some parents get to read to their children and some don't. It's commenting on the fact that we can't all have the same thing, that socialism doesn't make us all absolutely equal. There's no ability to do that. And remember that the absolute equality, the absolute is the qualifier for the Toolman terms. It's 100% no leeway. Everybody has to be equal, and that's hard to do. We're gonna get back to that in a second. So there's other things that this is referencing in reality that might not have been present at the time it was written, but surely make sense now. And that is the idea of like our education system in general. Standardized testing. You all are in college, you know you had to take the SATs, the ACTs. Beyond that, requiring standardized curriculum across the board with No Child Left Behind and, what's the other one? Common Core. Common Core is the other one. So having these certain standardized ways of teaching limit certain types of students from being able to learn. And that's something that Common Core was trying to do, something that the No Child Left Behind was trying to do, was trying to make opportunities more equal for students to learn in different ways, but it didn't really have that effect. We can't standardize because we all learn differently. And so taking a test might not accurately judge somebody's intelligence, whereas somebody else might be a good test taker and not know the knowledge but know how to take a test and do well, but not really, for neither of them does that explain or accurately showcase what their intelligence, what their knowledge is. It also, let me give you an example. So a lot of our discussions, if you couldn't tell, are probably not things that you're going to have in other classes. I do not teach like other teachers do. And wouldn't it suck if I had to be exactly like every other teacher that you have? To me, it would suck. Hopefully to you, it would kind of suck because I think differentiation and having someone who's not got to stick up their butt is rather a nice change of pace from other teachers. Not that all of them have stick up their butts. But think about the differences you have amongst your teachers, not only in elementary school, middle school, high school, and college, but just in general, people teaching us things in different ways. If we all had to do it the exact same way, I don't think people would learn as well. I certainly don't think people would be quite as happy. I wouldn't be happy at all having to teach like everybody else because I'm a nonconformist and I like to do things my own way, and fuck you if you want me to do things your way kind of attitude doesn't fit well with standardization. And this also is referencing some of the standards that we are getting rid of, like teaching cursive in school. I don't know how many of you guys actually got to learn cursive. I know for a long time they were trying to get rid of it, and some places still have gotten rid of cursive. And the problem with taking away standards like cursive, yes, we're going to type most of our shit for things, but what are our documents for our country written in cursive? And if you can't read cursive and you can't write cursive, you're not going to know what the Constitution says. Say all the technology goes, are you going to be able to read that document to know what your rights are? No, not if you don't know how to read cursive or write cursive. So it's keeping essential information from us for our ability to keep ourselves free that this is focusing on. And that's one of the definite connections for it. They were trying to get rid of handwriting altogether in school, which they weren't able to do because we do need to know how to write things in case technology breaks down or that we have no access to it and those types of things. We have to still be able to communicate with each other, and getting rid of something like that is taking a step back towards that idea of slavery and being unable to communicate with each other and form ideas and use our brains and think analytically so that we can't stand up for ourselves. Remember, we were talking about those with the stoic elements? There's also some satirical elements in here, some of those characteristics that we went over in class that I had you write down the definitions of, like vividness, creating vivid details. He does this again and again and again with the noises, especially in his head. Said like a burglar alarm, like a ball peen hammer hitting a milk bottle, like a car crash. All these things that create actual images and sounds in our heads so that we can start to experience them with George, so that we can understand also how terrible these sounds are and how much of a headache he likely has pretty much consistently, which leads to that lack of ability to think. And the funny thing about all of these noises is, and how they're supposed to make him equal to Hazel, because this is the comparison that we have and we're shown, is that Hazel is still left out. She is perfectly average. She has no handicaps whatsoever, which means she's not pretty, she's not smart, she's not strong, and she's not fast. She's none of those things, because those are the things that are being suppressed or oppressed in other people. And it's very obvious that she's still left out because she has to ask, hey, what was the noise this time? And it's still creating, she still knows that she's less than because she's not given those handicaps. Do you see how that logic and that forced equality does not work? It does not actually create equal amongst the people, even though these few details or characteristics are seen as equal. She even says, she says it a little envious, so she's still jealous. She's still competing with him because she doesn't have the same as him, because we're not born the same. So part of another connection with this is this question. How would you feel about having to wear a mask or weights to keep you clumsy and ugly in order to suppress you to the lowest common denominator? Essentially, that's insulting people who are average in this society, because they are seen as the lowest of the low and everybody must sink down to them. Because can you bring everybody up? Not really. You really can't. And so how might this have spurred in the society? Well, they're giving us a little bit of a clue with the connection with the handicapper general and Hazel. So it's probably the people who were seen as the lowest, who were not treated as the pretty and the wealthy and the intelligent are. Think sports, think doctors, think celebrities, right? They got jealous, and so they started making small changes in the laws and the governing system until one of them got in charge, the handicapper general, who's the most average looking. She looks like Hazel, which also makes me allude to some of the syndromes and whatnot that make people look the same, like Down syndrome. You can tell that somebody has Down syndrome, and it shows a connection with them. Not that I'm saying that Down syndrome should be treated unequally or they're not smart or any of those things. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there's a link in the connection of how they're described to that type of physicality. I don't think they're referencing Down syndrome. Just an example. But people who are so-called less than stood up for themselves and made everybody else have what they have, essentially, instead of being able to step up and do things to benefit themselves in any way they might not have been capable of, but obviously they were somewhat because they got power. So there's this back and forth there with that idea. Hazel also, as that normal person, says, who knows better than I what normal is? Let's unpack this for a second. Do we want normal people in charge of us? Do normal people know what's best for everybody? I don't know what's best for everybody, and I'm definitely not normal. I don't know if I'm more intelligent or I'm definitely weird. But does anybody know what's best for anybody? Does anybody in a single position know what's best for people in other positions? This is the problem with having a republic, is that the people get up into this higher status, and it's essentially a form of racism, although it's more stationary, like our position in life rather than the color of our skin type of racism. I like to call that one hueism because it's one form of racism. But the position that they hold makes them better than us, and therefore they cannot understand what it's like to be us anymore, which is why a republic is not that great. Although a full democracy would not be that great either, because I want you to think about the most average person you know, and then think about how half the population is less intelligent than they are, and the numbers would even out with the people who are more intelligent than that person is. And we don't want stupid people making decisions for us, but we also don't want people who are power hungry making decisions for us. So it's a very hard way to govern a large group of people, because utopias can't exist. We can't make everybody happy. It's a utilitarian type of system to do what's best for the majority, and the people who are screwed in it are just kind of screwed. But that's playing on the idea that we don't want someone like Hazel in charge. Because they're trying to make everybody equal and smashing them down to the lowest common denominator, they're essentially torturing their citizens. Think about George and the amount of weight he's got to wear and how that trudges him down and makes him tired. About how Harrison is given glasses to make him have headaches, and he's got 300 pounds of hardware on him, and he has to shave off his eyebrows and all these other things. They're essentially torturing their citizens to keep them in line. And the reason they are still suffering through this torture is that they're afraid of losing the progress that they've had. Think about the phrase that they said, if I tried to get away with it, then other people would get away with it, and pretty soon we'd be right back in the dark ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? Well, part of that is talking about the differences between capitalism and socialism, and what socialism turns into, which is fascism and communism and those types of things. Because we have all this progress of freedoms, and we're able to undo some of the prejudices that we have lived with and suffered with in oppression and that type of thing, we are really afraid of stepping backwards, of undoing some of the forced equality that we have in order to make us all actually a bit more equal, to treat us better. We shouldn't treat other people worse to make it equal to the experiences that those who have it worse have. We should lift all of them up and treat everybody better instead. But this is showing, of course, the opposite to make that example, to exaggerate and show why we should do the opposite of what he's showing us. It's that idea of having to take 2 steps back to take a step forward. Sometimes we have to backtrack and pivot, and it is part of what he's talking about with the Dark Ages and us competing with each other the way we do. So right after the Dark Ages section, they're just starting to get into this actual analytical conversation, and he asks that question, what would happen to society? And then he gets a noise, and he can no longer follow the conversation. So this is referring to that one, the attention span, but also, again, that inability to think long enough to analyze and stand up for oneself. And this also references currently, even though, again, he didn't intend this. Those people, have you ever been in the middle of a conversation with somebody and then they suddenly are answering a text message instead of talking to you? And it's that jumping attention span that he's referring to here, is that there's an inability to have deep conversations and deeply connect with people. Because think about it. What does this lack of thought do for our emotional connections with each other? Can we have relationships? Can we have that without conversations? Can we have education? Can we work efficiently? Can our standards of life be positive without the ability to analyze and to think critically? And we're just kind of going through the motions at that point. It also leads to this idea that anyone can be taken when nobody can think, because we're not tied to them. If somebody comes in and takes your son like they took Harrison, you just kind of sit there and take it. Don't do anything about it, because they can't think long enough to know that something's wrong. And part of this ability to think, again, leads back to that education and the idea of effort. Is it the effort that counts, or is it results that count? In some cases, effort counts, like you put in effort in a workout, and that counts. Were you 100% working at your best that time? No, but it still had benefit to it. Can you follow a diet 90% of the time and not have that effort rather than the results? Sometimes results don't show for a little while in that case. Effort in math also counts when you do those really long math problems and you get points before you veer off and do something wrong. You get points for doing the process right. You get points for trying in English class. Now, yes, results should matter sometimes. In the medical industry, it should matter. In our engineering, it should matter. In our construction, it should matter, because we don't want someone to put in their best effort and build a bridge that's going to collapse. It seems kind of ridiculous. And one of the things that is created in this world with the things that they focus on is how sure are they that those bags are heavy enough for that individual, that people aren't faking it to get by and skirt the system. I'm not sure how they do those tests, but there are definitely questions that we need to think about, especially when we have that competitive versus socialistic society that is America. And one of the rebuttals to this idea is they put all these weight on people, and that's the one case where they're actually making people stronger. Isn't that interesting? They're making them strong, but they lack intelligence. They lack beauty, which means they're pretty much just sheeple, and they're going to do what they're told, and they can build big, great things because they're strong enough to do so. And they have to continue increasing the weight. He kept doing for Harrison. He kept outgrowing them way too fast, which is indicating that evolution, they're forcing evolution, because evolution comes in a time of strife, and they're just increasing the inequality between people. The people who aren't strong enough to have bags, and the people who do, and just keep adding on to them, because the more you work out, the more you lift weights, the easier that becomes, and the more weight you need to lift to make that same effort possible. Effort, result, once again, reference there. And that's part of the thing about them. These handicaps indicate their inequality. It's not just that everybody wears the same mask. That would be equal. But the more beautiful you are, the more hideous your mask must be, which indicates that that person there is still beautiful, which means that there's still inequality present and obvious in their society. And people can tell when other people hear the thing in the ear radio, because they don't hear it. They don't need to be reminded not to think about those things. But maybe they can't think hard enough about those things to really question the difference between them and the person with the ear radio. And the one person who is able to think about these things because he outgrows his handicaps so easily is seen as dangerous. He is essentially the enemy of the state. He is their opposition, which means they have to demonize him in their media and their propaganda in order for us to fight against his ideals, his intrusion of culture and the ability for him to overthrow the government. So they have to demonize him so that we will fight against him and the changes that he might bring. Now, he is a metaphor for a whole lot of things that we'll talk about as we get deeper into this. And he is one way to show people that they don't have to accept these handicaps, and that obviously would take the power away from the state who has instituted them, which they don't want, which is why he's under-handicapped, he's a genius, he's an athlete, and he's regarded as extremely dangerous. It's the only way they can get away with punishing him in the public eye, is to demonize him. And the thing about Harrison as the rebel, essentially, in this, is that he is the other extreme. He is really no better than Diana Clampers would be. Because think about any dictator who has seized control through revolution and only created the same dictator with different variables. That's all that's happening in a lot of these revolutions, because as soon as somebody gets power, or those who seek the power are corrupted, and things go back into the same pattern over and over and over again. And they show how Harrison would be absolutely no better than Diana Clampers, because even as he charges in, "I am the emperor," and he stomps his foot on the ground and shakes the whole place, "You will do as I say." What does he sound like? A toddler throwing a tantrum. Somebody who thinks that they should be in charge in everything they say, and they're the center of the universe. And it's this evil villain kind of motif that they're having. He would just be a new dictator. Think about, "I will reward you for doing things for me," and handing out power. "I'll make you dukes and earls," and all these other things. And it's just the same thing. People giving other people power and not limiting themselves, but limiting other people. They will limit other people because of the differences in opinions and how utopias cannot exist. And when he is handicapped and about to break his handicaps, he says things like, "Even as I stand here crippled and hobbled and sickened, I am greater than any man who has ever lived. Now watch me become what I can become." What are they trying to say about competitiveness? That competitiveness makes us greedy, that it makes us mean to each other, it makes us step on each other, and all those other things. And it certainly does do those things. But it also is a positive attribute of a populace, because if we are not competitive with each other, we don't make advancements. You need to have at least two people or two companies or whatever competing with each other so they keep pushing each other to make things better, versus having something like a monopoly and only competing with yourself, and therefore not really having to give a shit, not really having to do anything to advance themselves, and just being placed with being in control and being mean to people. And that usually is what ramps up, instead of things like technology and whatnot. And the story shows the competitiveness as almost being barbaric, because he says, "I will take whoever stands up first as my empress, and she will be my mate and claim her throne." It's quite barbaric in a way, and it's funny that she is, of course, the most beautiful of them all, because that would traditionally be how it was: the biggest, strongest dude with the power and the prettiest female, and that's how a lot of them gained power, and how a lot of people still gain power: money, looks, influence. And the reason Harrison has these things is, think about how likely a man like Harrison is, and he's a 14-year-old boy, by the way, but how likely is anybody like Harrison to exist? He would have awed the god of thunder, Thor. So they not only equate him to a god, but make him better than a god. He's 7 foot tall, absolutely brilliant, absolutely gorgeous, absolutely strong. He is the highest of each of these attributes that they claim to be so important. It is 1 in a billion chance, maybe more, to get somebody like Harrison, which may be why he's seen as dangerous. But those are the people who used to be in charge, were those people who were anomalies, or they were evil, or they were seen as curses and all those other things. But somebody like Harrison's unlikeliness would make him a powerful person indeed, because there would be very few who could combat him. And that's part of the thing about forcing evolution. Forces more of these types of attributes to succeed, because we see that those are the ones who keep surviving through the torture that is being implemented upon them. So towards the end of the story, we see them dancing, and there's this over-exaggeration, this hyperbole once again, of them defying the laws of the land and of gravity and of motion, and they just kind of hover there and they kiss. Why show them so exaggerated? Why not make it realistic? Why create this vivid description like this? Does it show how bad the standard was before? That any type of talent might seem miraculous. They were not likely hovering there. I mean, yes, it's fiction, but let's get real. Nobody can do that. But it might have seemed like that because of what they had to compare it to before, when there's the absolute minimum shown and something that's really high up there in comparison seems like a miracle. Seems like people could just float there for a long, long time. With this idea of oppression, with this idea of the various dictators and this idea of competitiveness versus socialism, and I've mentioned a few times that we are both, and I want you to think of our culture as this. We have very stereotypical mom being the gentle caretaker. She makes you feel better. She wants to take care of you. She gives you soup when you're sick. She does your clothes when you're busy. You know, all these things that socialism takes care of those people who need to be taken care of. And we absolutely need those systems to take care of people who need it, those who are handicapped, those who are unable, not unwilling, unable to do these things. And to make everybody else compete for what's, for what they have, because they are able to do the work. They are able to advance themselves if they would put in the effort. Not putting in the effort doesn't reward you with somebody taking care of you. We all should be able to take care of ourselves, and if we can't, that's when we need the help. And that's where the capitalism and the socialism combine into what is supposed to be a well-balanced society in which thrives in the economy and takes care of those who need it, who can be sympathetic and strong. But it's skewed quite a bit. Our capitalism has gotten a little bit. The rich has too much of the money and the poor have not enough, and we become that wage slave that I was talking about earlier. And we are giving to people who could do because they're lazy and they don't want to. I'm not saying all people who get obviously are lazy and don't want to, but there are those there who are ruining it for the rest of them. Whereas there are those there who are really good at being competitive and getting people's money that are ruining it for the rest of them. It's the greed on both sides of the spectrum that makes the combination of both socialism and capitalism seem like it doesn't work. It's the same reason why socialism and capitalism can't work on their own, is because of greed. All of this boils down to greed and wanting to be better than somebody else rather than being the best that we can against ourselves, and not competing in that regard with each other. Competing with ideas rather than with natural abilities that we can't change. Treated equally, have equal opportunities rather than being forced into our position in life because of where we were born. So that's kind of what they're getting at with this ruthless egalitarianism again, of trying to force everybody into equality, and why it doesn't work. It just hurts people. And it doesn't just hurt people it's torturing, it hurts other people because they don't get the benefits of those people who can be competitive and make miraculous things to make their lives easier. That's how that works. That's how we work with each other. Anyways, ranting. Gonna get back to, at the end of the story, the TV burns out. Why has this happened? Do you think this is happenstance, or do you think it's intentional? I think it's intentional, and if you look at Spark Notes for the story, which you can absolutely use as one of your sources for it, it talks about the theme of television and how television creates propaganda, which makes us believe things, which is another part of the dumbing down process of citizens, is believe what the state tells you, believe what the news tells you. By the way, the news does not have to tell you the truth at all. Legally does not have to tell you the truth, because it's considered entertainment because of ratings, and there's a whole lawsuit with Monsanto about that in Fox News. And that's part of the reason why the television is present throughout, why they're getting all this information through the television, because it is biased, it is skewed, and it makes us believe things that it wants us to believe, that the government, the governing system, the ones who regulate what happens and what's shown on TV, which might be why it burned out in this story, so that they could not see what actually happened to all of these people, and they would forget that bad things, atrocities were happening, that the government was killing and oppressing people for life, for breaking the rules that they willy-nilly put on these people. At the end, the very, very end, George has a doozy of a sound, and it is the sound of a riveting gun. Was this the shots fired by the handicapper general? I think the placement of the gunshot at the end, when Dynamite Glampers is threatening to shoot all of these people, is perfectly placed and purposefully placed, because if you keep hearing all of these things that are happening to other people, it is reinforced why you don't break the law. Don't take that thing out of your ear. Don't pull those balls out of that bag, because this might be you. You will get hurt and shot. They arrested Harrison initially, but they've just started murdering people for breaking the law. So it seems like a good reminder that the state has control over you. Obey or die. One of those dystopic characteristics, remember. are going to conform again, or you're going to die. My final note on this is, when Harrison attempts control, he is a terrorist, he is a revolutionary, and he is a monster. But what is the handicapper general when she does the same things? She's our savior. She's protecting us from the change that Harrison represents, from a possible worse dictator, or possible freedoms in which we can demonize her all the more. And part of this comes with the idea that, this question, is it murder when the government kills? Why not? Because the government makes the rules. They get to decide what to call it, and we just kind of have to go with it. So the government has so much more control. It's like one of the presidents ordered bombings in the Middle East that killed over 100 kids, under 18 or younger. Just pretty much a whole school full of kids was ordered by, I think it was Obama that ordered that one. And it wasn't, he never got in trouble. He's not considered a murderer for that. That was the government doing what it needed to do for the safety of whatever they want to dress it up as. And there was no real need for it. Drones bother me in war because it dehumanizes and desensitizes and all that other stuff. Anyways, the point is that when the government makes the rules, they get to call what they do whatever they want because they're in control. It's back to that power issue and maintaining that power and keeping people from taking it from you by reducing their ability to fight you. Sheeple. Alright, we will get into more detail with this again as we break this down via Toolman terms, which will be a later video, and through my notes that I have for you guys once you've written your first drafts. So that's what I've got. Please let me know what you saw, what connections you made, if you have any questions about the things that I ranted about, because I get pretty rant heavy about this. And I will see you guys next time. I hope you enjoyed it.